The Night Bus. Chapter 13. The Boy Who Cried Mistake. For the next few days, right up until the weekend, all the whole school could talk about was me and how I had seen the thief. Even Randy and Lavinia and kids I usually went after began to boast that I had told them things whilst taking their sweets and crisps and money. But the truth was, no one knew anything, because I hadn't told anyone anything, not even Will and Katie. The stories seemed to be like growing all by themselves, like invisible seeds watered by invisible words. By home time on Friday afternoon, without me even saying a thing, I'd become a skateboarding champion who had chased down the invisible thief all on my own, right after Will had nearly broken his leg doing a triple bar jump. The only person who didn't seem to care was Mei Lee. So I tried my best to make her care. I tripped her up, and I called her names and laughed at her weird lunches, and I even got Will and Katie to accidentally, on purpose, spill a bottle of extra sticky, extra shaken fizzy orangeade all over her. We all got a week's worth of detention for everything. But she still pretended that I didn't even exist. "We need to come up with something better for her," remarked Katie as we headed home on Friday after the first of multiple detentions Mr. Lancaster had given us for the orangeade bottle trick. "She's acting like she's not scared of us at all. It's really weird." "Yeah, let's think of something really good over the weekend," said Will. "Hey, you guys, do you want to go boarding at Piccadilly Circus tomorrow in case the thief comes back?" "Oh, they won't go there again, stupid," said Katie, sneering. "Nobody steals from the same place twice. Look at all the different places they've stolen from this week. They stole stuff from that square named after the cheese." "Leicester cheese," grinned Will. "My favourite." "Right," said Katie, rolling her eyes. "They stole Charlie Chaplin's stick and Mary Poppins' umbrella and the other Paddington Bear sandwich from there. And then, after that, they stole those lamps from the front doors of the place where, the Queen buys all of her food from." "Fortress and Masons," interrupted Will knowingly. "No, it's Fortnum and Mason," corrected Katie, shaking her head. "I mean, none of it makes sense, does it? But one thing they're definitely not doing is going back to somewhere they've stolen from before." "But all the places are still in the same part of London, though, aren't they?" pointed out Will. "That Fortnum place was only down the road from the fountain, so you never know." Will looked over at me, as if asking me to back him up, and I kind of felt sorry for him because I knew he was desperate to get interviewed by the police and become as famous as me. So I just gave him I guess. As we reached the corner shop, we slowed down to see if there was anyone with anything we wanted. But only a few people were around, and Mr. McEwen was watching us. So we carried on walking. "Do you want to come to the park tomorrow?" asked Katie. "My brother said he's going to get me one of those new frisbees, the ones that make a noise when you throw it." Will shrugged. "Maybe." "I can't," I said. I didn't want to tell them that I was going to the police station just yet. I wanted to surprise them with the news after Thomas had been caught, and I was in the papers proving everyone was wrong. Mum had said the police wanted to record me properly and take a statement, which meant she was finally taking me seriously too. "I'm still grounded," I said, because technically I still was. "Oh, that's rubbish," said Katie. "Yeah," I agree, thinking about how exciting it was going to be to make an official statement and to be listened to properly for once. "Yeah, it's totally rubbish, isn't it?" Now, my interview at the police station didn't go exactly as I expected. First of all, there was a man called Inspector Wide, whose face was so wide that my face could fit into his at least twice. Took me and Mum into the waiting room, he did. He told me that hundreds of people were ringing to say they all knew something about the thief. "However," he said, eyeing me carefully, "so far yours is the only story that has checked out, so we're going to put it on record if that's okay with you." I hadn't realised I was in competition with hundreds of other people, and that put me in a bad mood. After Inspector White had finished talking, Officer Miriam and a man called Mr. Riddles, who he said was a sketch artist, came and took me and Mum into a small grey room. They asked me to tell my story again and describe everything I saw, just like Mr. Lancaster did sometimes when he wanted to check I was telling the truth. They made me answer so many questions about what I had and hadn't seen, and what bus me and Will had taken, and what had happened at exactly what time, and if I was sure it was Thomas from the park. I started wishing I hadn't said anything to anyone at all. "I've already told you this," I moaned. "His name is Thomas. He lives in the park. Sometimes he's outside McEwen's shop. It was him." "Look, it doesn't hurt to be sure," said Officer Miriam, smiling. "It doesn't hurt you," I muttered, kicking the table hard enough to make a sound, but not so hard that it shook anything. "OK. Last thing," said Officer Miriam. "Can you describe exactly what the man you saw at Piccadilly Circus looked like? We want you to tell us in as much detail as possible." Taking a deep breath, I described what Thomas looked like. And Mr. Riddles asked me lots of questions about the shape of his nose and his eyes and the bushiness of his eyebrows. As I talked, he drew quickly, making loud scratching noises on the white pad resting on his knees. Mr. Riddles, he had a large swirly moustache that was orange, and his glasses were orange too. He didn't look like someone who would work for the police. "Was it a fluffy beard or a curly beard?" said Mr. Riddles, for what must have been the 7th time. "Both," I said. "It's sort of like fluffy and curly." "Like this," said Mr. Riddles, holding up a picture he'd been drawing. Mr. Riddles had tried to draw Thomas from my description, but I've never described someone's face before, so I didn't have enough words, really, for exactly how he looked. But the drawing had Thomas's half-fluffy, half-curly beard, and his wrinkly old black coat collar, and his slightly bent nose, which I guess were probably the most important things. When I nodded, Officer Miriam said thank you and told me I could go home. She also told Mum she would be in touch if anything happened. But, just like most grown-ups, she lied. Because by Sunday night, with no warning at all, Mr. Riddle's picture of Thomas the old man was on the night-time news, floating behind a reporter who was telling the world about the invisible thief had finally been spotted by an anonymous source. "Hector! Hector, you're an anonymous source!" cried Lisa, as Mum patted me on the back and told me that she was proud of me. And Hercules clapped without really knowing why. Helen didn't say anything and seemed to get even grumpier when Dad phoned from somewhere in Norway to tell me, "well done," and that I could pick one thing I wanted him to buy for me on account of me helping the police. By Monday morning, the drawing was everywhere. I mean, everywhere. The police had used it to make a giant "Have you seen this man?" poster, and then not just in newspapers but on big supermarket advertising boards, the sides of buses and lampposts, and even special milk bottles. There was even a poster in Mr. and Mrs. McEwen's shop window. They never put anything in their shop window normally, not even signs for lost puppies. Will and Katie told everyone it had been me who'd described the thief to the police, and by the next day I was being followed around and asked to sign copies of the poster for everyone. But the more posters people bought for me to sign, and the more I had to look at the picture of the old man, the more I began to feel that something about it wasn't right. By Wednesday, I was starting to wonder if the police were playing a trick on me and maybe had changed the picture somehow. Do you think the picture looks like the trolley man?" asked Will and Katie, as I watched them adding horns and a red moustache to one of the posters outside school. Katie stepped back and looked at the poster with her head to the side. "Yeah, if you look at it this way and pretend he's melting a bit." "Sure," said Will. "You know, just older and uglier." After we'd drawn horns and snot balls and lizard tongues on 3 more posters, and I had signed them too, I headed home, still wondering why the picture was bugging me. As I opened the front door, my nose hoovered up the smell of freshly fried chips. It was my lucky day. Lisa's homemade chips made out of potatoes with the peel on were still the best thing on the planet to eat, even though she'd never made enough of them. "What's that, Hercules?" I asked, chucking my bag into the corner of the kitchen. He was at the table scribbling at something with his drawing pencils and glitter pens. Hercules held up one of the wanted posters with a proud smile. He'd covered it with glitter stars and he'd coloured the woolly hat bright green. "Where did you get that from?" I asked Lisa as she put down a large bowl of chips and chicken nuggets and on a plate on the table in front of me. "Oh, we got it from the lamppost outside, didn't we?" asked Lisa as she stroked Hercules' hair. "Now, eat up quickly, please. Hercules has already had his food. Helen's got some friends coming round soon and they're going to need the table." I grunted. I hated all of Helen's friends. All they did was giggle and carry around fuzzy pencils and pretend they were doing homework together when really they were just signing the names of their make-believe boyfriends in the back of their books. Smothering my mountain of chips and nuggets in ketchup so that it looked like an exploding volcano, I gulped it all down as Hercules busy coloured in his poster. You could always tell when Hercules was being busy and serious because he hummed to himself and he kicked the legs of the chair as if they were drums. He'd just finished going over the eyes in bright blue pencil mixed with golden glitter and was now colouring in the beard in bright red crayon, even though he'd coloured the hair that was sticking out from under the hat in silver glitter. I stopped chewing and I gave an extra loud gulp. I suddenly realised what was wrong with the poster and why it had been bugging me all day. The man at the fountain, he had taken his hat off when he had bowed at the screen. And when he had, I'd seen the top of his head. It had shone a strange silvery colour, just like Hercules' glitter, which meant that his hair hadn't matched his beard, because his beard was dark. But Thomas's hair did match his beard. They were both dark. I had seen it when he'd gotten angry that day in the park and taken off his hat, which meant, the picture was wrong and right all at once. "Pooh!" cried Hercules as the crane in his hand accidentally went outside the lines. Mr. Riddles had drawn exactly what I had described to him at the police station, but the face on the poster didn't look like Thomas's because it hadn't been Thomas's face that I'd been describing. It was another face, an old face that in some strange way looked familiar, but didn't look familiar at all the same time. I dropped the extra large chip I'd just picked up and pushed my chair away from the table. I wasn't hungry anymore. I'd probably never be hungry again. I had made the biggest mistake anyone on the planet could ever make. And no one could ever know. The next chapter, 14, is called The Kitchen of Soup. The next morning was so grey and wet and windy, it felt as if winter had suddenly come back and it was trying to make my mood even worse than it already was. I got wet on the way to school because the zip on my coat was broken and I couldn't find my hoodie anywhere. And once I got to the playground, Mr. Lancaster was shouting at everyone to head straight to the class even though it wasn't first bell yet, so I couldn't even get any snacks off anyone. The whole school seemed to shake and shiver with the wind and huge fat raindrops sploshed like cannonballs onto the windows, dribbling down the glass and leaving behind wobbly slug trails. The weather made everyone quieter than normal. Mrs. Vergra had said we could sit where we liked until the bell rang, but there wasn't much to do except talk. Or catch up with homework like Riania and Joseph were doing, but nobody else was sad enough to do that. Not even May Lee. I could see her playing some sort of puzzle game with Robert and giggling. "I think I might just die if I get any more bored," said Katie, holding up her chin with her hands. Will and me were sitting at her table. "Do you think that's possible, to die from boredom?" Not waiting for a reply, she added, "Lavinia and that new boy were meant to bring me gobstoppers as well. I'll have to try and get them at lunchtime. Will nodded, but I wasn't really listening. I was looking at the front of the class where Robert and May Lee were sitting. Here, what do you think, H? Asked Will, thumping me in the arm. Huh? Can you believe they got 72? 72? I asked. Gobstoppers? No! Will looked at Katie, who was shaking her head at me. Homeless people, said Will. The police arrested 72 homeless men yesterday. What? I asked, feeling a bit sick. Yeah, because of your poster, said Katie, moving her glasses up and down behind her ears. Hey, imagine them all standing in a line looking the same. That would be so funny. I opened my mouth to ask if they were sure, but was interrupted by the bell ringing and Mrs. Vergara telling everyone to return to their seats. I got up and went to my table where Rajesh was waiting for me to give him his secret morning punch, but I couldn't be bothered today. All I wanted was to get home, go to bed, and make my head stop thumping. I waited for the day to finish, but it wouldn't. In fact, it dragged on, and the rain and the wind and the low grey clouds made each lesson feel like forever. Mrs. Vergara tried to make things fun by putting on some music during break time and reading a funny book at lunchtime, but she seemed to be boring even herself in the end, and she gave up. The darker and wetter the day and the skies got, the more I couldn't stop thinking about the poster and the 72 old homeless men Katie had imagined standing in a row. Maybe it didn't matter if I'd got it wrong. I'd given the right description after all, just the wrong name. Maybe one of the 72 men they'd arrested was the man I'd seen. And if none of them were the thief, then they probably knew who it was, or would at least know what the signs meant. Besides, people on telly were always talking about how homeless people were stains on the community, as if they were blobs of dirt in those TV adverts for fabric conditioners. Those 72 men had probably been up to no good anyway. I'd done everyone a favour by getting them arrested and off the streets. But if that was true, then why had my stomach started thumping as much as my head? Why was I worried if Thomas had been caught and put in jail in place of the real thief with the silvery hair? Why did I care if, because of me, lots of homeless people were arrested instead of the real thief? It didn't matter. Except I knew it did. Because if the truth came out, the police and Maylie and Mum and Dad and Helen and Mr. Lancaster and Mrs. Vergara and the McEwens and the whole school would think I was a coward and a liar and had tried to get Thomas into trouble on purpose. They'd never believe anything I ever said or did again, and maybe the police would want to arrest me for obstructing justice, just like Helen had warned. I had to find out the truth, and there was only one person who could help me now. Except she now hated me even more than I hated her, and even though I kept looking at her in class all day, she didn't even look back at me once. Now make sure you all wrap up nice and warm now, said Mrs. Vergara as the bell for home time finally rang and everyone hopped out their seats like kangaroos. I don't want any sniffling in class tomorrow. Katie and Will didn't bother putting on their coats. It was only Thursday, which meant we still had 2 more days of detention left to do with Mr. Lancaster for picking on Maylie. Aren't you coming? Said Will as I pulled on my coat. I shook my head. Can't. Headache, I said, and I ran out the corridor. I had to speak to Maylie, even if it meant Mr. Lancaster giving me an extra 3 detentions just for missing this one. I saw Maylie walking with Rania and Robert and Joshua out of the school gates, and, bowing my head low against the pelting rain, I followed them out of the playground from a distance. Robert and Joshua stopped at the McEwen shop, which left just Maylie and Rania walking towards the park. I worried that Rania wasn't going to leave her, but then at the end of the road she turned right and Maylie waved and turned left. I sped up, wondering why Maylie was taking the long way round the park instead of going through it like she usually did. She walked past the first entrance and then the second. Suddenly she began to run, so I began to run too. I'd nearly caught up with her when suddenly she started, then she stopped, making me nearly crash into her. She turned round. Why are you following me? She asked, looking out from underneath the pointy hood of her bright yellow raincoat. She had tied it so tightly around her face she looked like a squash but lemon. I need to talk to you, I said. My voice was shaking from the cold. About the poster and Thomas, I think I've made a mistake. Maylie stared at me. I was so wet and cold that I couldn't even feel my face anymore. Leave me alone, she said. Before I could respond, she turned round and hurried down the road, turning right at a crossing just before the high street. I ran after her in time to see her walk straight up to the doors of a big red brick building, which had a banner that said Soup Kitchen. Everyone welcome. Above it. Groaning out loud, I forced myself to follow her in. Walking through the huge wooden doors, I entered a hall full of tables and chairs and people in coats, chatting and drinking tea from paper cups. The room smelt of like wet dog and tangy old fruit so much that I felt as if I could taste it. I pinched my nose closed and I scanned the room for Maylie. I spotted her heading to the back of the hall, waving at people as she walked past. It's a good day when Maylie's around, called out a man in a bright purple coat, giving her a thumbs up. Maylie gave him one back, but she didn't stop. Maylie, I cried out. She ignored me and she kept walking. Hey, Maylie, tell your dad to put some more spice in the food, would ya? Joked a woman with her wild blonde hair who was holding a cup of tea. Her eyes looked both young and old at the same time, and she was carrying a big plastic bag on her arm that was so muddy and tattered it looked as if it had been dug out of the ground. Will do, said Maylie, still moving. Hey, Maylie, stop, I yelled, pushing past everyone to try and get to her. Maylie, have you got any of my favourite cookies today? Asked a man with huge brown ropes of twisted hair. I'll ask, she shouted back. By now we'd reached the back of the hall, where there was a huge big silver kitchen laying on the other side of a huge stainless steel counter. It was filled with people wearing blue plastic gloves and black t-shirts that said Lotus Soup Kitchen. They were all making teas and chopping things, moving around each other as if they were like in a dance. Maylie, you're late, darling, said a tall man who was unwrapping big blocks of butter. He was dressed in one of the big black t-shirts and faded blue jeans. He had the same black hair as Maylie's, except his was short and spiky, and he had exactly the same face shape too. Some volunteers haven't shown up, so we're a bit short today, he continued, as he dropped a kiss on the top of her head. Sorry, Feifei, said Maylie, taking off her coat, still ignoring me completely. Hey, who's this? Asked the man, noticing me. I'm a friend, I cut in before Maylie could say anything. I've come to help out, I added. I looked over at Maylie, but she was looking straight ahead. Oh, it's very nice of you to volunteer with us, said the man. I'm Maylie's dad, Cheng. I always like meeting my daughter's new school friends. What's your name? Kevin, answered Maylie quickly. I gave her a frown, but she continued to look straight ahead at her dad. Mr. Cheng smiled at us both, not seeming to notice anything strange. Well, Kevin, you're very wet, eh? But your arms look strong. How about you both get washed up and take over the cheese grating duties? We've got a few hundred potatoes all in need of mountains of cheese. Before I could say exactly, actually, I had changed my mind, a woman handed me a plastic apron and some gloves and pushed me to the middle of the kitchen. Come on then, challenged Maylie, glaring at me hard. Since you've come to help, or are you too chicken now? No, I said, following her to the sink, copying everything that she did. I washed my hands and put on the apron and the gloves, and then I went and stood next to her at a big metal table. A huge man, who could easily have played a giant in any play I'd ever seen in front of me, and chuckled, Good luck, newbie. Hurry up, ordered Maylie as she began to grate her block of cheese. Every few minutes she would pause to put large handfuls of cheese onto the rows of steaming hot potatoes that were quickly being placed in front of us. Well, not wanting to be beaten by her, I grated as fast as I could. The kitchen was full of the noises of people cooking, microwaves pinging and ovens whirring, pans of water boiling and bubbling. There were lots of things being made, not just jacket potatoes. One woman was filling containers with rice and kidney beans in some sort of a red sauce and handing them to people who were licking their lips and smiling. The colour of the sauce reminded me of the things Maylee bought in her packed lunches. It made me wonder if, instead of teasing her about them and throwing them in the bin, maybe I should have tried them. If what she had was even half as good as the bright red bean dish smelt, I would eat it all the time too. Peeking out into the hall, I could see that it was even busier now. It was packed with people who were just as smelly and as weird-looking as each other. Some of them were sitting and talking to people in the Lotus Soup Kitchen T-shirts, holding their hands and nodding. Some were playing chess or cards or even board games. Right at the back of the hall was a woman surrounded by piles of old clothes who was helping people find pieces that would fit them. And next to her was a man standing at a table covered with tins of food and bags of bread, and he was giving it out to people. There wasn't a single packet of crisps or any chocolate bars on that table, which made me wonder what happened if anyone ever wanted a treat and not just like a loaf of bread and tin of baked beans. My arms began to get sore from all the grating, so I slowed down and I looked around the room again. A young woman who looked better dressed and cleaner than anyone else there was walking through the hall. Her face and her eyes were red, and right behind her were two small children who looked wet and miserable. Coming up to the kitchen counter, she waved at Mr. Cheng. "Hi, Cheng. Have you got anything for the kids by any chance?" she asked quietly. "Always," he said, going to the back of the kitchen, pulling out 2 large bags from underneath a bench. And I could see they were filled with sweets and crisps and toys. The children clapped their hands and immediately started looking through them. And the woman started to cry. Now, said Mr. Cheng, leaving the kitchen to give her a hug. "Why don't you tell me what's happening with those bailiffs of yours, eh?" Leading her to the back of the hall, he went and sat down with her at an empty table. "Why was that woman crying?" I asked Maylee, as I tried to catch up with her cheese grating. She was stronger and faster than she looked. Maylee shrugged, as if she didn't really want to answer me, but then she said, "Her husband keeps gambling, so they've never got enough money for food, and he's not very nice to her. That's why she comes here with the children. Sometimes the food she gets here is the only food they have all day. And my dad and everyone were trying to stop her from losing her house." "Oh," I said. "Come on, kids, chop chop, just 100 more portions to go. It's busy tonight," sung the giant man as he put another big block of cheese next to me. I began wondering why soup kitchens were called soup kitchens, where there didn't seem to be a single bowl of soup anywhere. By the time all the potatoes had cheese on them and they all had been handed out to the people in the hall, my arms were numb and I was so tired that I felt as if I'd run at least 13 marathons. "Well done, Kevin," said Mr. Cheng, and he handed me and Maylee a large cookie and a glass of milk each. "Here you go, for your brilliant effort." I stared down at the cookie and glass of milk. "Wait a minute," I said, looking at Maylee. "Don't you get paid for this? Do you just get a cookie?" "Well, no one here gets paid," said Maylee, rolling her eyes. "Everyone just volunteers to help here." I looked around at the giant man and the old woman who were now putting hot cookies on big plates, and the 2 young men who were dancing to the radio while scrubbing the cooker. I decided all of them were just mad. Maylee went to a bench at the back of the kitchen and sat down. I followed her and I watched as she took a big bite of her cookie and a gulp of the milk. "Why did you tell your dad that my name was Kevin?" I asked, sitting a little bit further down the bench. "Because if he knew who you really were, he would have made you leave," said Maylee. Oh, I could feel myself turn bright red. "You mean you tell him?" Maylee nodded. "I have to. When I come home covered in orange-ade, sticky, with scabby knees because I've been pushed over and stuff." I turned the cookie over in my hand. I hadn't thought about anyone going home and telling their parents what I'd done to them. My parents never asked me anything about school unless I got into trouble, so I assumed it was the same for everyone. "Oh," I said, not really knowing what to do next. We sat in silence for a few seconds before finally Maylee spoke. "So what do you want? Why did you follow me here?" she asked. "I told you. I think I've made a mistake. I think I gave the police the wrong name, so I need to find him. Thomas, I mean. I wanted to know if you knew where he was." Maylie shook her head. "No one's seen him since that day he left the park. You know, when he found out that you lied to the police about him." "I wasn't lying," I argued, wanting her to know that I wasn't a liar. Well, not on purpose anyway. I thought it was Thomas. The thief did look exactly like him, I promise, but then yesterday I remembered. The man I saw took off his hat and bowed in front of the big lights, and when he did that, he had like silvery hair on the top of his head, not dark brown like Thomas's hair. I looked at Maylie and I waited to see if she believed me. Her eyes narrowed and she was biting her bottom lip, so much that it disappeared into her mouth. "So what do you want to do?" she asked finally. "Why don't you go and tell the police you made a mistake?" I shook my head. "I can't. They'll probably think I just obstructed their justice on purpose and they'll arrest me." "Yeah," she said. "Probably." I swallowed the milk as slowly as I could, waiting for her to say something else. Just as I reached the point where there wasn't anything left to gulp, Maylie nodded. "Okay," she said slowly. "I will help you. But only because I want the police to know it wasn't Thomas, or any of them," she added, nodding towards all the homeless people in the hall. I was so relieved that I released a small burp by accident. "Thanks," I said. Maylie thought for another minute, and then she leaned forwards. "We need to find Thomas," she said. "The only way we can prove he didn't do it is to catch the actual thief, and to do that, we're going to need help." She looked towards the front of the kitchen where the giant man was handing out takeaway boxes at the counter. "Here, Solo! Is Catwoman here today?" she called out. The man looked around the hall, slowly revolving left to right like a lighthouse, and he shook his head. "Nah, my plum. She's not here today. Probably visiting her friends. She'll be here on Saturday, you know. She never misses Saturday lunch." "Thanks, Solo." Looking back at me, Maylie asked, "Okay, you. Can you be here on Saturday, 12 o'clock? "Yeah," I said. "Why?" "Because I think I've got a plan," said Maylie. "But first, we need to talk to Catwoman."